Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Science iCafé. My name is Terry-Ann Chebet. I will be moderating this conversation this afternoon. I am really excited about it, and I'd like to know who you are, where you're joining us from. Please tell us on the comment section where you're joining us from, what your concerns are, what you're curious about, what it is about this topic today that tugs at your heart, because it is a topic that is very close to home to all of us. So I just want to see how many people we have joined online. When we started off, we were about 50, which I think is a wonderful number of audience to begin with. I just want to remind you all that we are all pretty active online today, and I'd love you to be part of the conversation as well. The hashtag to use is toxic business. And when you follow that hashtag, you'll see all the partners and stakeholders that are part of this conversation. Be sure to tag them in our conversation this afternoon as well. So good afternoon once again. This is the Science iCafé. We will be focusing on concerns around harmful pesticides in the Kenyan market, and most importantly, what is being done collectively to ensure that this situation changes. If you've just joined us, my name is Terry-Ann Chebet. I am a communications consultant, and today I am the moderator of today's Science iCafé. I'm really excited to be here. Now, as we all know, people around the world and here in Kenya, people like you, me, our families are probably eating toxic pesticides that endanger our lives. Many pesticides are proven to cause cancers, heart disease, breathing problems, infertility, and even brain damage in children. And unfortunately, if we look at the global context in which the pesticide debate sits, that we see a lot of double standards. There's human rights abuses, there's the negative impacts of biodiversity and the climate crisis as well, especially where industrial agriculture is concerned. In Kenya today, we have seen through evidence, and part of the conversations that we'll be having this afternoon is that farmers and farm workers are paying the price for harmful pesticides with their own health. The aim of this forum is to make visible the ongoing political process and findings documented in the dossier, which we're discussing today, which is the scientific report on pesticides in the Kenyan market, where we'll get to hear the views of local experts and scientists. We'd like also to let you know, very importantly, that the dossier was submitted to PCPB. As you may all know, PCPB is the regulator of pesticides in the country. And this dossier was submitted by 4 civil society organizations and prepared by a task force who are the organizers of this event. I'd like to say a big thank you to BIBA, that's the Biodiversity and Biosafety Association, RODI, Resources Oriented Development Initiatives, the Kenya Organic Agriculture Network, that's KOAN, and RTFI, which is the Route to Food Initiative. And these are the organizers of this event. Thank you so much for putting this timely conversation together. As I mentioned in the beginning, we're using the hashtag toxic business, of course, not just today, but to ensure that our food and health is safe. So keep on using it, tag your politicians, tag your member of parliament, tag your local government, tag the national government on conversations around toxic business. So I'd just like to quickly take you through the program and what to expect this afternoon. We'll have opening remarks by Professor Wahome. Thereafter, we'll have a look at the findings, focusing on environment, which will be brought to us by Dr. Victor Shikuku, and thereafter, the findings in regards to food safety, which will be brought to us by Dr. Catherine Kunyaga, and thereafter, Dr. Teresa Omoyo will be giving us stories from the ground in as far as where health is concerned. And we will then have Dr. Silke Bolmo, who will tell us more about the task force call to action to the government, as well as recommendations for Kenya. Remember, this is a conversation that we all must be part of. So that will be critically important in identifying what is your role, what is my role in this conversation. Thereafter, we'll have a public discussion, which will be a Q&A. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A segment, I will be able to read those out. We will also allow you to ask your questions directly to our experts. So do feel free to raise your hand when we get to that point. That will be at around 4 o'clock. And thereafter, we'll have our vote of thanks, and then we will call it a day. So I'd like to welcome you all again, all once again to our event this afternoon. I'd like now to invite our very fast speaker who will be telling us more about what really today's event is about, as an expert, from the views of an expert and a scientist. Thank you so much, Dr. Professor Wahome. Karibu sana for the opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Kenyan, for this invitation to speak to all the concerned persons that have joined this forum. I welcome you because this is a very important forum. To begin with, I want to introduce myself probably very, very briefly. I work at the University of Nairobi, Department of Animal Production, and for a long time, since 2012, I've been studying organic food systems, ones that really depend on nature to ensure productivity, sustainability, nutrition, and health. We have been concerned by the upward trend in use of chemical pesticides over time. And the use has actually increased in some parts of the country than others, and has been associated with the negative health in terms of environmental health, in terms of human health, in terms of animal health. Actually, animals have been rather spared because they don't live a long time, and therefore the showing of symptoms that takes a long time to do in living animals does not show as quickly in domestic animals, which are slaughtered before they become very old. And it shows more in humans because they live longer and they are more sensitive to their health. The thing is that data has been collected over time, and a variety of organizations have been involved in collecting this data, principally from a variety of angles, from production type of view, from a human health type of view, from environmental health type of view. And eventually all this information was collected together by a task force, which was put together by 4 organizations, which I think Leila is going to show on the screen in a moment. But they are people who were in the task force came from all types of institutions, as you saw on the screen. I will not list the institutions or list the individuals that are listed on that screen, but you can have a look at them and see how widespread the task force was. And each adduced evidence from their own perspective. And we brought this evidence into a dossier, which was presented to the Pesticide Control Board in September. Now, in the dossier, we proposed action in Kenya. The action that we proposed was that some of the active ingredients that were noted to be specifically highly toxic to people, to environment, to life, we recommended that they be withdrawn. There were other chemicals who were probably less toxic, but had no alternatives, and we felt they had a significant importance in food production that we recommended to be withdrawn in phases as alternatives for their use are found. And then there were others which we felt that need to be retained for now, so long as there are mitigation measures for their use, which includes extensive training programs for their users and putting in place IPM strategies that can ameliorate or reduce their use. In a summarized way, we can look at the list of the ingredients that we put into the dossier and what we confirmed. We found, to begin with, that 4 chemicals that are widely used in Kenya are known to affect reproduction, including human reproduction. We found that 8 are known to be carcinogenic. We found that 6 are known to be mutagenic. Now, carcinogenic means that they have been implicated in causing of cancer. Mutagenic means that they are known to change the genetic structure of animal cells, which means that they may also lead to carcinogenesis, to development of cancer. We found that 4 are known to poison the nerves, and there were 8 which are known to have a variety of disruption of the endocrine system, which means that they interfere with the hormonal profiles of the living bodies of animals and humans. There were others where we did not have sufficient evidence, but they were also known to have possibilities of causing similar effects. At least 2 were known to were suspected to cause reproduction effect. 6 were suspected to be carcinogenic. 4 were suspected to be mutagenic. 2 were suspected to cause poisoning of nerves, and 6 were also suspected of causing hormonal effects. There were others that we had no data about, and therefore we did not make any recommendation concerning them. Our concern in this seminar are those that you have already firm belief that they need to be removed, and I will present a summarized view of why we think they should be removed. To begin, 7 of them are very toxic. And of these 7, 4 can spread very, very fast to very wide areas and last long in the environment, which means they could be used where I'm seated now in Hola, and they will spread because of their solubility in water through the rainflow, because it's raining in this season, and the water goes to the river and affects organisms and humans downstream, including all the way to the ocean. Others have less toxicity and less possibility of persistence in the environment or spreading into the environment. But the ones we feel very strongly about, the 13, have this combination of ill effects, and we suggest that they be immediately withdrawn from our use in our country, because we have evidence that other countries noted their effects and removed them some time ago from their own environment, although the companies that manufacture them are still manufacturing them in those countries and exporting them to other countries, including Kenya. We will not be able to give the whole list, but we recommended 13 chemicals to be immediately removed. Amongst them, some of the well-known chemicals like malathion, and some of the less well-known chemicals like Cabedazem. If there is somebody with specific interest, you can refer them to the dossier that we presented to the PCPB, or we can discuss this later during the chat. Finally, for the ones that we need to be removed in a phased manner, we already said that they have harmful effects, but if managed properly, they can be used until alternatives are identified and made ready to replace them. But for now, this is the summarized view of today's discussions, because these chemicals are known to cause these problems. And I will ask Terian to go ahead and invite the next speaker. We will see you later during the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Wahome, for highlighting what we will expect in today's conversation. Clearly, just giving a highlight of some of the findings in terms of the effects of what has been discovered so far: cancer, reproductive health, nervous poisoning, hormonal effects. Clearly, this affects each and every one of us. I'd like to also recognize Honorable Gladys Boschole, who has joined us. As we all know, she has been a critical voice in as far as harmful pesticides are concerned, and I know that she recently petitioned Parliament to order the withdrawal of 237 pesticides and herbicides with harmful chemicals. Mheshimiwa, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. All right, I'd like to now welcome Dr. Victor Shikuku, who will give us just an overview of the findings in terms of the impact of these pesticides to the environment. Dr. Shikuku, over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure for us to have a conversation of this kind, especially at a time like this. I want to say that this is a very timely conversation that involves all individuals, because consciously or unconsciously we are affected by these chemicals. And so my talk will be on the environmental concerns. And when we talk about our environment, we are only as happy when the environment is happy. And so our own existence becomes threatened if our environment is not safe. And so when we talk about pesticides in the environment, I will talk about briefly the cycle of pesticides in the environment. I hope my screen is visible to all the audience. Thank you. So when we talk about the environment, briefly, our environment entails the air, the soil, and the water generally. And so we will be interested in, after application of the pesticides for whatever use, what will be the fate of these pesticides in air, in soil, in water, and so forth. What will be the impact of these chemicals to the soil microorganisms, to the organisms on land, to the organisms in water, and so forth. And therefore, the other speakers will be interested probably on the effect on humans and the occurrence in food. And so these pesticides, of course, the data shows that after applications, they can be mobile in the environment. They can move down through soil in a process we call leaching, and they can contaminate what we may call groundwater, which we consider generally to be the safest water we know. These pesticides can find themselves to surface waters. By surface waters, we mean rivers and lakes and so forth, through surface runoffs. And I think that diagram there can show us in a brief way some of the transport modes that these chemicals exhibit in the environment. And so now the next thing I just want to bring to our attention is what is the, yes?
Just one moment, please. Are you able to put your slide on presentation mode?
Is it okay now?
Yes, it's good. It's perfect now. Thank you.
Thank you. So I come from the Department of Physical Sciences, Kaimosi Friends University College. So we can continue. So we have just briefly highlighted the cycle of pesticides in the environment and what we consider our environment. And now we want to talk about the impact and the fate of these pesticides in the environment. We cannot talk about all the ingredients. Of course, it will take a whole day here. And so in brief, this is what I will simply highlight. Number one, that all these registered pesticide ingredients have been examined, but only their effect on certain species. And therefore we have a knowledge gap on their effect on every species imaginable. But of course, from the effect we can see in other species, we can always draw conclusions and make decisions on what is observed already. Number two, we have several ingredients that have been registered in the country, and studies have been done concerning their fate in the environment, in food and human. Nevertheless, we also acknowledge that not all of the ingredients registered in the country have been studied in this country. Of course, you can find data in other countries concerning these chemicals, but it will be important for us to have a complete picture if all the ingredients in use in this country can be evaluated as far as their fate and impact is concerned. And so that means that our data in that sense will be insufficient, but still it is enough for us to make legitimate conclusions. And of course, we can also be careful not to make overstatements from what is observed as well. And so we can limit ourselves to what the data says. And of course, it will still be sufficient for us to make reasonable conclusions. I will just talk about 3 chemicals for the interest of time. The first chemical ingredient is what we call Chlorophyll Force. It is the most widely used pesticide in the country, at a very important detail. Nevertheless, I want us to notice that this particular chemical is only registered to be applied for barley, maize, wheat, and pineapples. Nevertheless, the data that will be presented later, you will realize that this chemical is found in so many other vegetables and food crops in this country, which indicates a misuse of this particular chemical. The next point I want us to note about this compound is that it is found in at least 25 products in the country. What this really means is the more products you have with a given ingredient, the more access people have to this ingredient, and the more the probability of misuse and occurrence in the environment as well. And so if you have a restriction with fewer products with the ingredient, then the exposure tendencies will go down significantly. The next thing I want us to realize is that you have those colors, or you can see there on the screen, where you have green, orange, and red. Green simply indicates that the risk is low. Then the orange indicates that it's mild, while the red shows high risk. And so when we talk about this compound ingredient, which is the most widely used in the country, in terms of reproductive toxicity, we have a red there, which indicates that there is a high risk among Kenyans to having these effects because of the prevalent use of this chemical in the country. When we talk about bee toxicity, fish toxicity, we also have red there, which indicates high risk as well. Now, do we have data showing that this chemical is in our environment? Of course we do. For example, in the next slide here, you have studies conducted in the country, and they are very recent as 2015, showing the presence of this chemical ingredient in soil. And that is from Zoea Basin, and this other one is from Narok region. And so we have local data showing the presence of this chemical in soil. And so it raises the question, what is the problem with this chemical in soil? Of course, there are concerns. Number one, the first concern is that there are living things in soil also, which are good for us. Soil health is important. And so there is sufficient data that shows that this particular ingredient has an impact on the functionality of soil microbial diversity. And so in terms of soil health, the presence of this ingredient in soil is of great concern. Apart from soil living organisms, we have those that live on land, like chicken, for example. We have scientific data also showing negative impact of this particular ingredient on broiler chicks. And of course, now this one should tell us that we should not be neutral as far as the existence of this ingredient in our environment. Apart from the living things on land, we also have living things in water. And we have scientific data also showing that Chlorophyll Force is also toxic to fish. And therefore, we should be concerned when we can detect this chemical in soil and in water. And therefore, I will strongly also add my voice to the recommendation of the task force concerning this ingredient, and the recommendation is that it ought to be withdrawn immediately because of those reasons that we have spoken about, including being used in crops that have not been regulated for use. The next chemical I will talk about briefly is Imidacloprid. It's also another ingredient of interest. And here what I want to point out is that this chemical is found in 52 products in Kenya. Again, this should raise an alarm in that the more products you have on the market with the ingredient, the higher the accessibility and the higher the potential of misuse and occurrence in the environment. In terms of concerns human health, you can see there in terms of reproductive toxicity, we have red, high risk. This chemical is high risk in terms of reproductive toxicity. In terms of bee toxicity, again, we have red, which is also concerning. In terms of fish toxicity, we have mild, earthworm toxicity mild, and birds mild as well. And so those are reasons sufficient to have us concerned. And that is why the task force recommended, based on this data, that this particular chemical ought to be withdrawn from the market immediately. Lastly, the last compound that I will just draw our attention to, of course, we have many compounds that I had mentioned, but at least these three are of particular interest to point to the gravity of the issue. We have this chemical we call Cabedazem, which is a fungicide also. We have at least 17 products in our market with this particular chemical as an active ingredient. In terms of human health, we can see that mutagenicity, which it has the capacity to cause mutations. It is an endocrine disruptor. In terms of reproductive health, all these have red, which indicate they are high risk. In terms of fish toxicity, it is high risk as well. And so this tells us that the occurrence of this particular chemical, either in soil, in water, or in air, it raises serious concerns. And do we have data showing that this chemical is in our environment? And the answer is yes. We have a very comprehensive report that was published in 2020, last year, showing the occurrence and the risk assessment of many chemicals in Lake Victoria. And this particular chemical of interest was also flagged out in this report or in this research paper as occurring in water. And therefore, the occurrence of this chemical in water is of great concern. It is not only present in water bodies, it is also persistent in soil. And the longer it stays in soil, of course, the longer the impact is anticipated. And therefore, its occurrence both in soil and water is concerning. What are some of the effects? While it is in water, we have research that shows that it induces developmental, biochemical, and behavioral disturbance in zebrafish embryos. And therefore, the occurrence of this particular ingredient in our water sources like Lake Victoria that I have highlighted should not be taken lightly. And therefore, I'll wish to also add my voice to what the task force has recommended, that this particular ingredient should be withdrawn from the Kenyan market immediately. Of course, other than the effect in fish, this chemical being persistent in soil, research has also indicated that it has a negative impact on the soil microbial or bacterial community after repeated applications. And therefore, the task force looking at these evidences recommended that this chemical should be withdrawn immediately. So I will wish to end there by just saying that we cannot afford to be neutral as far as our own health and environmental health is concerned. And these particular three ingredients, among others, should not be spared when it comes to withdrawing them from the market. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shikuku, for your views and thoughts. And as you say, this is an issue that touches each and every one of us. And, you know, just listening to you and knowing that I'm from the Trans-Nzoia Basin, where I thought, and I've always believed, has the cleanest food and the cleanest kales. I'm beginning to think I should have invited my mom to join this conversation as well, because it is a critically important conversation. I'd like to thank each and every one of us who's joining us on the chat. I see where you're joining us from. We've got Evelyn Agutu who's on there also telling you, you know, what you can do for those who have any questions. I see some questions around sharing of the presentations and slides. Those will be responded to shortly by Evelyn Agutu, who's on right there with you. I'd also like to encourage you to take part in the online conversation. If you do hear something that's, you know, just lights a bulb in your mind or in your head, please feel free to share that, because we will just begin to trigger a conversation around what must be done about these harmful pesticides. I'd like to now welcome Dr. Catherine Kunyanga. Dr. Catherine will tell us more about the findings in as far as food safety is concerned. Dr. Kunyanga, karibu sana.
Thank you, Terian Chebet, and so far so good. So I have 10 minutes to present on food safety concerns on this sum of active ingredients that we are talking about. Of course, as the previous speakers have mentioned, we have a lot of information in the scientific report that we've shared. So mine will be just to highlight a few of these active ingredients that I think are of immense food safety concern. And just to start us off, just to highlight that as a country, as Kenya, really, we've moved really beyond worrying about food insecurity as being a critical issue. And now we are seeing issues or challenges to do with food safety. And not only with pesticides, but other concerns like pathogens in food. But in this discussion, we are seeing a lot of issues coming out with pesticides, and that's why we've had this petition coming up. And a lot of scientific evidence showing that some of these pesticides should actually be withdrawn from the market immediately. Now, as you know, really, it's the right of every Kenyan to have access to safe food, nutritious food. And actually, for me, I think food safety concerns is a responsibility for everyone. So we might see it and blame the farmers or the politicians or the policymakers or the agrovets or any other value chain actors. But for me, I think food safety is a responsibility for all. And I think this public talk and this science cafe is a good step to start. So as you know, our sort of production system is heavily, as Terian, you mentioned, really, we have our mothers at home with small plots of land, growing all sorts of vegetables and fruits and using all these chemicals and really relying mostly on agrovets or sometimes maybe not really experts on what pesticides to use. And this really leads to a lot of misuse. And for me, from a food safety perspective, I'm more concerned about consumer risks and health risks that we expose our consumers to. So for me, this presentation, I'll highlight two of the active ingredients that I think really pose a lot of consumer risk and a lot of health issues with regard to their consumption as a key critical issue. So as I mentioned, really food safety is a critical concern. So yeah, we are food insecure in some areas, but really, as much as we want access to food throughout the year, we also need to look at what kind of food we are eating. And this is because data has shown, and a lot of scientists and most of us have seen, we have increasing foodborne illnesses and a lot of non-communicable diseases and other health risks that consumers are exposed to. So, and FAO and WHO have really highlighted this, and so many conferences done and call to action around access to safe food for everyone. And basically, as I've highlighted, there are a lot of issues that farmers are facing. First of all, sometimes they don't know what chemical to use and on what food and how to use it. So we have a lot of issues around that, and this leads to the current problem that we are facing. So the other thing I would want to highlight as a food safety concern is that the government has a responsibility, and I'm happy that they are taking this seriously to implement regulations, to enforce regulations that ensure that we comply to usage of such chemicals in our foods. And especially in the context right now, you saw the other day we had a big conference on climate change in Stockholm. And this has to do a lot also with the right to safe food. And the other thing, and we saw this with COVID-19, we always have new hazards. And when I look at some of the active ingredients, really, I would say they're new hazards because people really, as we were doing the dossier, we didn't have a lot of data. And this is because not much has been done, not much risk assessment has been done. And this poses then new risks in terms of contamination in our foods. And this means then we need a clear call to action, not only for people in agribusiness, but also in terms of sustaining safe food systems, agrobiodiversity, and promotion of healthy and nutritious diets for Kenya and globally. So I want quickly, given that preview, I'll focus on two ingredients that I think for me are very critical in food safety. I'll start with the first one, that is acephate, and this is an active ingredient that is organophosphate insecticide that is applied as a foliar spray. That's on the leaves when the plant is growing. And with this one, we have to be careful because it has a breakdown product, which is a metabolite from its breakdown. That is methamidafos. Sorry for being too technical, but this has been shown not to be approved in most countries, including Europe, where we export most of our products. But for me, for food safety, I believe that it's not only about safety with regard to foods exported to other countries, but also we have to be cautious about domestic food safety. And this active ingredient is actually very highly toxic from human studies to mammals, including human beings, and is an enzyme inhibitor and a neurotoxin. And it's been shown, and I am glad that we had something from the previous speaker about effects on the environment. So it's been shown to be highly toxic to birds, honeybees, and other aquatic species and earthworms. And in Kenya, actually, it's actually sold in 8 products and registered actually only for controlling, chewing, and sucking insects in tobaccos. But our latest study, this is from KOAN 2020, this is a very recent study. It's been shown people are actually using it in other things, including beans, tomatoes, kales. And this means then we have residues in our foods that poses a risk to consumers. And this then means we have to be very careful and really be concerned about the residues that we are seeing. And the other thing I need to point out, given the high toxicity in human beings, then this means then we can't really say we have a safe level that is possible. And for me, one of the recommendations would be that we desperately need a risk assessment with regard to this metabolite so that we can really have it off the market. And therefore, then if we are using it, then that means longer post-harvest interval, which is not really being done. And that would be the only way to assure consumer food safety. But from this study, evidently, then we did not have this PHI being done. The other thing I wanted to mention from recent studies and which has made us go to this option of having it withdrawn immediately is that it's been shown to have very high residues in some of our commonly consumed products. I can imagine most households in Kenya will consume kales, will consume tomatoes, French beans, cat, Meru County, you are there, tea, things like dried products. And this was seen in most of the counties like Kirinyaga, Murang'a, Mwea, and Meru, and etc. other counties. And the worst thing is that there's clear evidence of adverse health effects on humans, and this includes hyperglycemia, lipid metabolism, damage to our DNA, and also carcinogenic effects. So this has been clearly shown, and this shows then we have high morbidities, that's death rates, and this also places a big burden as a country in terms of healthcare cost. And one of the worst thing about acephate is that the exposure routes is that it can be absorbed by the body by just ingestion and also inhalation. And as we know, those who have walked around our farmers' fields, you see we don't have proper use of protective gear, and that means then these exposure routes become very risky for some of even our farmers who are our main people on the ground. Inhalation, you can see the obvious quick acute toxicities. Look at muscle cramps, look at excessive salivation, sweating, nausea, dizziness, and these things you feel immediately you are exposed to these chemicals. Ingestion, once you consume these as residues in your food, you have abdominal cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea. I know that people going to hospitals experiencing this, and sometimes maybe it could be impact of these chemicals in our foods. And science, and again, you can refer to our report. There's a lot of evidence that this compound is also a neurotoxic and endocrine disrupting compound because it inhibits one of our key enzyme that is choline esterase that causes an stimulation of our nervous system. And that's why you see in terms of acute or short-term symptoms, you see people experiencing nausea, dizziness, confusion, blurred vision, you have difficulty in breathing, you have muscle weakness, and sometimes in high exposures, you can get carcinogenicity. And Professor Ome already highlighted most of the active ingredients that we've mentioned, actually carcinogenic. That means they can cause some form of cancer in your body. And for this particular one is liver cancer. And a lot of studies have been done in animal studies, although we have really limited data in terms of human studies, but it's been clearly shown in animal studies that it can actually cause cancer. Then, of course, it can also cause reproductive toxicity. I think this was already mentioned, and there's a lot of evidence that this can cause harm to your growing fetus or embryo, especially for the pregnant women who are our main. Of course, most of these toxicity are more apparent in our vulnerable population, including pregnant women. And you can see this one is affecting the embryo and the fetus. So that means then the kids we are raising in the future generations will have this toxicity and other damages to their health. So with regard to this active ingredient, the recommendation is that we need a proper risk assessment, especially with regard to the metabolite, methamphetamine, and the acetate itself, and taking into consideration the toxicological potentials that are mentioned that can occur in presence of these residues in our foods. Then we also propose a risk assessment in terms of residue definition with regard to this metabolite also. And we also are going for the action that these should be withdrawn immediately depending on the toxicity that we've mentioned. So quickly, I would want to highlight the next active ingredient, that is Cabedazem, that is in food. And this one is a systemic fungicide that is commonly used in our food value chain, and is actually registered in 17 products. And this is mainly for controlling fungal diseases. And this is mainly in French beans and tomatoes, but also farmers are actually using it in snow peas, in squash, in broccoli, in onions, in capsicum, and even staple foods where it's not supposed to be used, like rice, barley, wheat, and fruits. Like in Kenya, a lot of studies have shown that it's used in fruits like mangoes and citrus and pawpaw. And we do not have any registration for use for kale or spinach, despite studies showing that we have residues of Cabedazem being found in kales, and this was done by KEFIS recently, and also a lot of work done also by KOAN in 2020 that is heavily used in zucchini, in melon, in rice, in maize, in cabbage, kale, and tomatoes. And as I mentioned earlier, you can imagine these are some of the foods that we heavily use. And look at the table there, you can see in terms of toxicity or in terms of human health and environmental health. And for me, in terms of food safety, look at the human health, a lot of effects around to do with carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, and also reproductive toxicity and neurotoxicity. So this means then this is another key area to look at, and one of the active ingredients that we need to look at. And as I mentioned earlier, being that in Kenya, we are using it in 17 products, and even in products that is not registered for, then this raises an alarm. KEFIS, which is one of the regulatory body, has already showed really we do not have registration for some of the foods where farmers are using it. And as I mentioned in the previous introduction, really, this is lack of awareness and other factors that we mentioned. The other thing I wanted to mention also that Cabedazem as an active ingredient is being used also in levels that are way above the MRLs that are set by EU and other countries, and especially for French beans from Meru in Kenya. And this has been documented well in our study, and you can read our reports for further information. Also, people have shown way above levels in tomatoes in Kirinyaga County, and also tomatoes in Nairobi. And I think a lot of studies in our report can have evidence that this is also very high in tomatoes. So quite worrying trend, given these are commonly consumed products. And the worst thing is that this active ingredient has a very long half-life, up to 6 months. So really, also we have issues to do with occupational re-entry exposure that can later, again, give us more issues to worry about. So risk assessment have also shown that we can have re-entry and also exposure in some of the fruits as you grow them. And these are commodities like grape, stone fruits, custard apples, pears, and other tropical fruits, which are unacceptable according to the levels. Now, in terms of human concern, it's been shown to cause a wide range of chronic effects because of the half-life, you can imagine, as opposed to the previous one that I mentioned, as more of acute effects. This one has more of chronic effects. You'll be consuming your tomatoes, your cabbages, your vegetables there in your rural area, in your local markets in Nairobi, but these effects come later. Chronic effects are long-term, and you can see, so later, like if you're a young girl, later you have embryo toxicity, you have teratogenicity, so those are abnormal deformation within your kids, future kids, infertility, issues to do with the dysfunction with your liver functioning, endocrine disrupting effects, and a lot of these. And I don't want to be too scientific. Being a scientist, I would not be that scientific. So this active ingredient, given this toxicity, and especially the chronic toxicity, we recommend that it has to be withdrawn immediately. And in summary, as I've presented, this is based on the fact that it's very persistent in water, in soil, and plants. So it can be transmitted. You're applying for this plant, but it can go to another plant. It can appear in your food in form of a food residue and cause really a lot of concerned consumer risk to the people consume these products in the market and are aware that these toxic compounds are in their foods. And as we said, the route of exposure being inhalation and also ingestion, then we have also to worry about our farm workers. And also given that also farmers are misusing it for other crops that are not intended for this, for use for this chemical, then this becomes a worrying trend. And I want to end there. Thank you very much. I think we can discuss more during the Q&A. Thank you. Over to you, Terry-Ann.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kunyanga, for that. There's been some really amazing feedback coming through from chat box as well. So I'd like to urge our panelists and all the other experts who are joining us to just have a look. If you do see something that you're able to respond to, please feel free to do so. But I'd like to just mention some of them, which I know we'll probably talk about when we get to the Q&A. There is, David says, I feel we lack knowledge and policies on taking care of our creation. Eric says we need to comment on the word, we should use the word misuse with care, as this word has in most cases been used to blame the users, while sometimes the use context can be a cause of exposure. This can lead to a wrong policy decision. It would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that as well. That was Frederick Otieno. And we do have quite a bit of coming through. I see somebody saying, he wishes this conversation could also happen in Malawi because, we sort of face or go through the same challenges. I see that Silha has responded to that. So panelists and the other experts, please feel free to get in and respond. I want to thank each and every of us who have joined. Remember, the conversation online. The hashtag is toxic business. Please be part of it on social media as well for those who are not able to join us this afternoon, so that we can just begin to trigger that conversation and hopefully trigger real change. I'd like to now welcome Dr. Teresa Omoyo. We have spoken quite a bit and listened to panelists about the impact to the environment, and we have had a lot about health in each of the presentations that has been given since we began the forum. So Dr. Teresa Omoyo will be telling us more about stories from the ground in regards to the impact to health. Dr. Omoyo.
Thank you, Terian. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We welcome you on board and thank you for joining us. Thank you for my other presenters. And I think they have quite highlighted a lot. And mine is just to bring on board a few examples that we've had during the experience of practice. And I want to highlight that very key is pesticide poisoning, accidental, which probably involves the people who are using it, and more especially, again, the people who are at risk, children. And we realize children tend from time to time to suffer from pesticide poisoning. Why? Because they are not informed of these pesticides and their side effects. They are not illiterate. They are not aware of the harmful effects. And even when it comes to storage of these chemicals, a number of these chemicals, sometimes children tend to confuse them with the usual chemicals that we use, like pharmaceutical products, right? And even the foodstuffs that children consume, because a number of them are actually stored in bottles or containers that are almost similar to this. Just a few cases that I had in my practice is like now you get, I remember we used to have children particularly presenting, but one case that was quite severe is a child who presented at the age of 6 years. And this child presented with signs and symptoms of malaria, fever, and you could easily trivialize and say, well, we are dealing probably with an infection. But on digging deep in the history, we discovered that this child actually had been found playing with an empty container of a pesticide. And so while at home, of course, he was vomiting. And when they came to hospital, the child was quite drowsy, although responding to stimulation. And they were still vomiting, very dehydrated. And of course, we know very well we cannot be able to assess levels of pesticide poisoning because a number of our hospitals are not very well equipped in terms of that. You have to send the samples to the National Public Health Laboratories, which is quite a distance from a number of our health facilities. And so all we did is linking the history of this child having been found playing with this container, we actually associated, we were able to make an impression of pesticide poisoning. And of course, the breath of this child was smelling this chemical. And so we managed the child was able to go home after some time. But what am I bringing up? Some of these people who are using this, they are not even educated on how they should be able to keep them in terms of storage. Even when it comes to the people working in the farms, they are not educated on how they should be able to use in terms of wearing protective gear. Even those who are provided with that, sometimes they actually ignore. Some of them feel the overall is so heavy and bulky, the mask is preventing them from breathing, but all the same, these are things that needs to be put in place and the public needs to be educated in terms of how these pesticides should be used. Again, I want to highlight that pesticides also pass through the placental barrier. So because they pass through the placental barrier, they cross the placenta barrier, they are able to affect the newborn, a child who has not been born. So the fetus who is developing can be affected. And some of the women sometimes can end up with an abnormal child in terms of weight. They end up with a child who is born prematurely, small for age. Some, they end up with stillbirths. Sometimes they can end up with spontaneous abortion. Why? Because there are developmental defects in terms of this fetus. Sometimes when the child is born, they end up getting what we call impairment of the psychomotor and mental development. Sometimes we end up with these children having hyperactivity, attention deficit disorder, and no wonder in our setup, we are seeing quite a number of children who are not able to concentrate in class. And these children, when they go to special, for special assessment, then they are referred to special schools. When they go to those special schools, the teachers are not even able to cope with them. Reason, we need to go back to how are we using our pesticides? What are these pesticides that are in an environment that needs to be dealt with, that needs to be gotten rid of, but we still continue to use them? Again, I want to highlight that there is the mother who is breastfeeding, and also chemicals can pass through the breast milk. They're actually excreted through breast milk. And so a number of women who work in the flower farms are exposed to absorbing some of these chemicals. And in the process, as they feed the newborn, these chemicals are passed to the baby. And studies have shown that in breast milk, we have a concentration of about 4.1 times what is actually required in the environment. And I want to appreciate my colleagues who have highlighted, when you look at the environment, when you look at the foodstuffs, all this, the human being is actually at the center and is the consumer of all these things. So is the person at high risk. And if we cannot be able to address this, then sooner or later, I see ourselves getting extinct. If not, all of us are going to die, because we need then to address this issue. Children and breast milk. So women who are breastfeeding, they need to be educated, they need to be protected. And it's not only working in the farms. Studies have shown that if they are living within about a quarter, a mile within the flower farms, so within the agricultural farms, they stand that risk of getting that the effect of pesticides. Again, when you look at the pesticides, others, of course, use it. Children, for example, find it an easier way of using pesticides as a way of committing suicide, those who want to commit suicide. Why? Because it is easily at their disposal. And so a number of these chemicals that are in an environment, we need to have control over them, and we need to do something, especially if through ingestion, they can be able to cause effect in our children. Through inhalation, they can be able to cause effect in our children, even through breast milk and through the transplacental, through the placenta when the mother is expectant. So it is important that all this is addressed. And I want to thank our team for coming together to put this. And I want to strongly argue that these pesticides, if they can be withdrawn in other countries, why then should we continue to have them in our country? And yet they are harmful. The farmer is ignorant. The farmer cannot be able to finance the analysis of the chemicals in that product, because it costs as much as 15,000 or more, which is almost impossible for a number of farmers. But the best way is our country, our government needs to come in place to protect its people. And I think I will be very brief because of time. Terry Ann, back to you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Teresa. Sorry, my mic was off. I was trying to share some of the tweets. And thank you for those who have been sharing online. The hashtag to use is toxic business. Please, you can follow on the chat. Evelyn will be sharing from time to time who the speaker is, so you're able to attribute the views that you have had correctly. So thank you so much, Dr. Omoyo, for your presentation. There are some questions on the chat box. I see that Dr. Shikuku has responded to some of them. I see that there's quite many. I have a feeling our 20 minutes of Q&A might be a little short for that. So if our panelists are able to answer within the Q&A or the chat box, please feel free to do that. All right, so we're now moving on to the next phase of our forum this afternoon. I'd like to welcome Dr. Silje Bolmore. She will be telling us about the task force call to action to GOK and recommendations for Kenya. Those of you who have been asking for the hashtag, this is the moment to really listen in because here we'll find out more about the call to action, which we should be able to share with our audiences. Tag your member of parliament, tag your politician, tag everybody you can, because this is a conversation that must be escalated. Dr. Silje, over to you.
Thanks very much, Terry. So it's up to me now to summarize everything and to give the call of action in probably 10 minutes. So I keep it short to keep question time open. So I think before I go into the summary, it's very important that everyone in the audience understand how a pesticide is actually registered. And very briefly, all of the active ingredients we are using in Kenya have been already registered somewhere else in the world, mostly in Europe or in the US. And what they do is studies, which we just heard of, impact on bees, impact on earthworms, impact on reproduction system. These are all studies which the industry supplies to the registration body somewhere else in the world. So it's not done by independent scientists. It's done by the industry who wants to register a pesticide. Now, what the registration body is then doing based on these studies, they say, okay, we register a pesticide because it doesn't pose a risk, or we're not registering it because it poses a risk. Now, many of the active ingredients which are used in Kenya are not, many of them are actually quite old. And that means they're not in use in Europe or in the US anymore because the registration body in these countries requested more studies, more new studies on other species or more best practice laboratory studies. So for the industry, it's quite expensive to supply these studies, and they're actually not going the route for re-registration in another country. What they do is then they sell it to countries like Kenya. And that's where we're sitting right now. So Kenya.
Dr. Silje,
she's muted.
You are muted.
Why am I muted? I'm sorry. Okay. So you haven't heard anything what I was saying?
Yes, the last
minute.
About the last minute.
Okay, great. What I was saying in the last minute was basically that many of the active ingredients in Kenya are old active ingredients, which are not re-registered in other countries because it's too expensive for the industry to supply any new studies or new tests. And what they're doing then is they're just selling it to countries like Kenya. So one of the call of actions is actually to ask the industry to supply these studies. You know, we all know these studies are very, very expensive, but the industry is responsible to supply the studies. Why are we not asking the industry to actually do that? So in general, we are dealing, and we saw that with the presentations from all of my colleagues, is that we're dealing with a very high uncertainty. We don't know a lot when we talk about risk assessment of pesticides in the environment and in human health. So as I said already, some of them are old. the impact on bacteria or fungus, which are really crucial for good agricultural practice, for regenerative, for agroecology. We need them for good food security in our soil. We don't know the impact of the pesticides on these organisms. We also don't know the impact on local species. The tests, the bee toxicity is done with the European honeybee, but not with the African honeybee or with stingless bees or anything like that. We don't know the status of bee populations in Kenya. We're not sure about it. We have some tendencies. We see that there are bee populations going down around Lake Naivasha because there's a lot of spraying happening in the flower industry, but there is no actually monitoring going on. And also local conditions, as my colleague said already, local conditions, climate, soil, many different conditions to the conditions where the pesticide has been registered originally. Normally, if a pesticide is registered, field studies need to be done. Environmental monitoring needs to be done. And as soon as a pesticide is somewhere very present in the groundwater or in the soil, this is a reason to ban a pesticide, which was the case with atrazine in Europe. But we don't know the situation in Kenya. There is no monitoring happening, at least no regular monitoring. And there's no mitigation measures implemented. All the pesticides being registered are only registered because mitigation measures are already calculated in the whole procedure. Mitigation measures like a buffer zone between a crop field and a river system of maybe 20 meters. How often do we see that in Kenyan situations, that we have a buffer zone of 20 meters? Probably not very often. Farmers need to be aware not to spray when pollinators are out. How many farmers are aware of that? Probably not many. And the same with the protection equipment as well. So the same situation with when we talk about the very high uncertainty about human exposure. Again, local consumption patterns are not included in the risk assessment. We heard women and children are very much under risk. And epidemiological studies are not happening in the country. We know the cancer rate is increasing, and for example, very much in Meru, but there is no epidemiological study happening to see what is actually the impact of pesticides in this whole situation. And that's why we're asking for a long-term plan to phase out certain active ingredients. And I just want to summarize again, chlorpyrifos and permethrin we mentioned, because they're heavily used by farmers. They have high human health toxicity, and we're assuming that there is quite an occupational health risk. With Cabedazem, Profenophos, and Acefat, we heard from my colleague that we found high residues in food, and especially in tomatoes and kale, which is their basic food of Kenyans. And we can assume a very high consumer health risk here. And in terms of the environment, we heard chlorpyrifos, Imidacloprid, and Carbendazim are quite risky ones and heavily used by farmers. But we also asked for a complete ban of already restricted active ingredients, like, for example, carbofuran is not registered anymore, but farmers are still using it. The same with dimethoate and Acefat, and we heard the breakdown product of Acefat is also very toxic, and we found it in kale and in tomatoes. The same with chlorpyrifos, and I very much agree that we shouldn't use the term misuse, because then we direct the shame to the farmer. But we also found out in the KOAN study that agrovet dealers and even extension officers promoting these insecticides for the control of aphids in cabbage, for example. So it's not to blame the farmer, it's really to change the whole system. As I said, we don't have the mitigation. What we want from the registration body in Kenya, from PCPB, is also to really redesign the registration procedure. We need to reduce the uncertainty in the risk assessment, and we need to look at the mitigation measures, which are actually not in place in Kenya. So the risk, the resulting risk is much higher than somewhere else, because we're not having the buffer zones, we don't have protection gear, etc. We also need to consider the local situations. As I said already, local species, local conditions, local consumption patterns. We eat much more maize than someone in Europe. Why is our MRL the same as in Europe? It needs to be much, much lower. And contamination needs to be assessed. So monitoring needs to be happening on food safety and also on environmental monitoring. And to close off, we would also like to see a transparent registration process involving all the relevant stakeholders. The registration body should be independent and industry should not be involved in the registration body at all. Independent experts should be involved in the whole process, in the scientific process of registration of pesticides. And very, very important is also to develop a strategy to phase out pesticides. It's clear to us we can't move from one step to the other, banning pesticides. We need to have a long-term plan. And this long-term plan should not only include the promotion of biopesticides, for example, just to substitute the toxic ones, but it should look at a holistic picture to include agroecological strategies to improve the soil, the plant health, so that we have less pests and we actually need to use less pesticides. And so much from my side. Over to you, Terry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Silher, for your views and thoughts, and of course, giving us the call to action. I'd like to very quickly open it up now to our Q&A. Thank you all for responding to some of them. I see we still have quite a number of open questions. And I'd like to urge our participants, if you do want to ask a question via video, please raise your hand using the raise your hand button at the bottom of your screen, which I will be able to see, and we will come to you. So I'd like to start off with Martin Ogindi, who's got a question for Dr. Shikuku. He says, with a growing population, how can we keep food supplies without using fertilizers and pesticides?
Thank you for the question. I think maybe I begin by saying that pesticides in and of themselves are not bad. We are not saying that we ban the use of pesticides, but what we are saying is that there are pesticides or ingredients of pesticides that we have singled out to be toxic, and we can perfectly raise our food without the use of these particular pesticides. And so I think we have nothing to fear that if we ban a particular number of pesticides, then our food production will be in problem and so forth. So we are not calling for the ban of pesticides as a blanket, but there are particular ingredients that we can do without.
Thank you so much. Laila, I see you've got your hand up. Would you like to say something?
No, sorry, Terry, I'm sorry, that was a mistake.
Okay, all right. We've got Maurice Ouma, who says, the presentation confirms that we are exposed and we're not protected by the government agencies, and it is as if profit is coming before people. Who is sleeping on the job, and how can remedy be sought? If Madam Honorable Gladys Cholet is still in the room, I'd like her to respond to that. But if she isn't, I'd like to have any takers from the panelists to please respond to who's sleeping on the job and how can remedy be sought. Professor Ahome, would you like to take that?
Thank you. I was just about to look for the mic and say, it's a complex question, knowing the Kenyan situation, and we will not answer it simply, as if it's a question that is being asked by a journalist and we're answering for sensation purposes. To begin with, the Constitution of Kenya 2010 charges all citizens with the responsibility of ensuring that our environment is safeguarded. So the first step is our responsibility as a people to keep ourselves abreast of all the things that are happening in Kenya and in the world. Then step number 2, take or put our government to task when we see things going against our well-being and our welfare. Sometimes we do not do this sufficiently because we are not sufficiently empowered with information. What we are doing today is to empower our people with information so that when there is a call for action, then there is sufficient numbers of people who will raise their voices and say we cannot continue the same old way as we have done in the past. There has been action in Europe, and I've seen a comment in the chat that the Europeans are banning use of chemicals even before risk assessment is complete on suspicion. This is because their civil society is sufficiently empowered with information to know when things are going wrong. Then there is a body which is charged with the responsibility of ensuring safe use of pesticides, the Pesticide Control Board. They, of course, like many public institutions, are not sufficiently resourced to do their job adequately. And maybe this is taking a toll in the way we have seen haphazard use of chemicals for uses that they are not licensed to be for, because the body was not sufficiently resourced to do what it should do. But there is also a question of initiative within the management of the institution, first to ensure that it does the maximum possible with the resources available, and secondly, to do the maximum possible to secure more resources. I think there are resources available because politically, when there is need for resources to secure underperforming public institutions, we see those resources being distributed to those particular institutions, even when institutions have no hope of ever being solvent. So it's a complex question. First, responsibility to me and you to pass the information. Second, responsibility to you and me to ensure that we speak up when we should. That responsibility, we lobby the parliaments, both county parliaments and national parliaments. And fourth, responsibility goes to the institutions that are charged with this responsibility. I would like, of course, to hear more comments from my fellow panelists. Thank you.
We've got another question, which is a follow-up to you, Professor Wahome, before I open it up to the other panelists, perhaps on the same question. Regarding alternatives to pesticides, what efforts are the universities making in getting the relevant government agencies to move towards organic pesticides? This is from an anonymous attendee. I don't know why they chose not to share their name.
No, I think it's okay because they want information. We people at the university collect information and pass it on to all those who want to use it. In fact, I already responded to that question by typing an answer to it. To begin with, our Department of Veterinary Public Health, Pharmacology and Toxicology over the years has been analyzing chemical residues on foods and in the environment. And so we have quite a lot of data on availability of these chemical residues wherever they can be found. At the same time, we have had a long running project, like I said earlier, in my department and in collaboration with 3 other departments of the Faculty of Agriculture on agroecological farming. We called it PROGROF, and it's on organic farming. And in this project, we looked for resources for products, both for plants as well as for animals, that were safe and would not harm the environment or harm the humans that were using them. And projects come and go because they're only financed for a specific period of time. But at the same time, we have had a project in our Faculty of Veterinary Medicine on natural products and their use as remedies for animal ailments. And this project was ongoing for close to 8 years. It is on halt for the time being, but I'm sure they are looking for funds to continue what they have already started. Now, our findings are public information. They are publicized in scientific journals as well as in meetings like the one I'm talking to today. So the information is available, but not nearly enough. A lot of money has been put in research of the chemical products that are in sale today, and some of which we are blaming for hundreds of months. Maybe I should say since starting late 1920s, there has been research work on conventional agriculture, well-resourced. Maybe now we need to lobby both our national governments, county governments, and international development partners to finance support of agroecology, because that's where the future is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Wahome. We've got a question from Beda Mengo. She asks, what are some of the consequences of immediately banning the chemicals? I'd like to join that with another question. I can't seem to see it now, but it is about farmers importing pesticides from neighboring countries like Uganda or Tanzania. Perhaps you can, as we respond to the question of the effects or the impact of an immediate ban, what happens to the farmers who, can still import it either way from the neighboring countries? Any takers for that? Dr. Shikoku, I see you're responding.
Okay. In my view is there is no impact or there is no loss in part of the farmer when we impose a ban on a toxic chemical, while there is an alternative chemical that is less toxic and friendly. And therefore, while we may not control, for example, access of the same chemical from the neighboring country, that should not make us hesitate to make the first right step of withdrawing the chemical from the shelf and letting the farmers use an alternative that is less toxic and more friendly to the environment.
All right, do we have any other responses to that question from the panelists?
Terian, I wanted to add that in food safety issues, we really need to have harmonization of regulations. And for me, if a product, let's say a pesticide is banned in one country, then if we have proper official controls at our borders, then that chemical essentially should not be sold, for example, in Kenya, from another country. And if our regulatory agencies are enforcing this, then we shouldn't have our farmers actually purchasing or using that particular chemical component. So for me, I think is all about, and as I said in my presentation, really when you talk about food safety, it's not about blaming one person, but is a collective responsibility. So the government have their role. So if this chemical is banned or is not supposed to be used in this country, then we shouldn't have it in our borders, and we should have proper official controls that ensure that we don't have that chemical there. And the fact that your poor mother down in the rural area who has no really information or education about this pesticide will end up buying that chemical because someone was sleeping on their job, then that means then the impact we are seeing, the toxicity we are seeing is because someone is not doing their job. And we are having this in our environment. We are having our consumers being exposed. You remember, and I keep repeating this, we had mercury in sugar, we had pesticides and other chemicals in oil, we had aflatoxin in maize, and yet there are people actually in the government, in our private sector, who are actually importing this. But if we are strong in complying to our regulations, our guidelines, and we have policies, but how is the compliance? How is the enforcement? Then if we have this in place, then I don't see how this could end up in our markets. I think we have to have strict compliance, strict enforcement, and those held accountable should really face the law. And I think if we have proper regulation, this can be done. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Kunyanga. Silke, I see you.
There's just one more thing that sorry about that I needed to add to that. We have the East African Common Market. I think that's what we are calling it nowadays. And we also have the East African Parliament. We know that things are not working as well as they should. But when they ban a chemical in Europe, they ban it across the whole common market, the European Union. And we, as a people, East African region people, should lobby our governments to make decisions that are made in each country and enforceable in the neighboring countries. It's a lot of work for the citizens. We cannot sit back and expect things to happen. We must take action as a people to ensure that our shared environment is safe, not just in Kenya, but also in Uganda and in Tanzania, in South Sudan, in Rwanda and Burundi. And when we can pull the Ethiopians and the Somalis on board, also in those nations as well, so that we have a safer zone. Because if only we try to make Kenya safe, then definitely Kenya will not be totally safe, because the question that has been asked will become valid.
Thank you so much, Prof. Dr. Silke?
Yeah, just very briefly to add on to the last two questions is, we need control, yes, but we also need empowerment for the farmers, because if the farmer has an alternative available, why should he or she use a very toxic pesticide which is banned already? The farmer is only using it because he or she doesn't have another chance, because either there is bad advice or no advice. So empowerment is very, very important. And I just see a couple of comments on the side in the chat with regards to Europe as a yardstick. I just want to clarify, I just took Europe as an example. We also looked at the registration status in other areas in the world. And with the new government in the US, there is a lot of movement in terms of banning pesticides as well. So that's stuck in the last 5 years a little bit, but it's also getting a bit more proactive towards getting rid of highly hazardous pesticides. So just to clarify that. Thank you.
All right. All right. Thank you so much. We've got Kennedy Kariuki, who's a participant. Kennedy, would you like to share your comments or question?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much, Terian. My name is Kennedy Kariuki, and I represent Thorium Organic Foods. My question, everything is nice. I really love what you're talking about, is what we talk about also, and we help farmers understand the importance. But now my question was, many farmers in the country get information through television. Is it possible now for most NGOs or any party that is actually talking about organic farming or the importance of the environment to mobilize resources and ask to have a television series which is coming on air every day, just like we have a television series which is called Shamba Shape Up, which is teaching farmers on good farming methods, but they use a lot of conventional products. So they advocate for conventional farming. Is it possible for us now, maybe NGOs which are talking about organic farming, to mobilize resources and be able to fund one television series which is coming, will be on live television, which will be talking about the importance of organic farming, the importance of using good pesticides, organic pesticides? That will be able to change a lot. Thank you so much. That's my question.
All right, thank you so much. Kennedy, do we have, I know it's both a comment and a question. I guess the stakeholders are all in the room, so I'm sure they should be able to reach you. We've got Martin Ogindi. Martin, are you able to share your comments or question?
Yes, Terry, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yes, my name is Martin Ogindo, and I just want to say that I am a former member of parliament in the 10th parliament, and I was also the chairman of budget committee. I'm not saying this for anything, it's because I've heard Professor Wahome speak something there that I want to put into context. And I've also introduced myself as party leader of Green Congress of Kenya, a party focused on ecological sustainability. I am not a scientist. I am probably a politician. And I rely on such webinar to get information. And I think the issue we are tackling requires that we synergize. And it is through this forum that we find ways of creating synergy. I appreciate what Ken Kariuki has just said, and that is at the heart of my question. Is it possible? Kenya is today having a population of about 50 million. Is it possible that we can produce enough food organically using organic fertilizer and organic pesticides to feed our population? That's my question.
All right. Thank you so much. Prof. Wahome, would you like to respond to that, or Dr. Shiko?
I suppose, Terry, the question is to me.
Yeah.
And I'll try and answer it in the simple way that it has been asked. To begin with, it's not probable that using all the chemicals we've been using, that we've been able to feed ourselves. Even as we talk, our people are starving in Kenya, and animals are dying, regardless of the use of these 13 chemicals that we are asking be removed from our market. That is the simple answer. Now, a more complex answer. We have been collecting information, both locally and internationally, on comparison of organic and other agroecological farming systems in comparison with what we call conventional agriculture. In fact, there has been a long-standing study conducted at ICIPE in Kenya by one lady whose name I appear to forget, and has documented the comparative performances of both systems, one using fully converted organic systems and the other one using conventional systems with minimal differences. Studies in Brazil and also in Denmark have shown that organic systems produce something like between 6 and 11% less than what you would call a highly chemicalized production method, without causing the adjoining harm that goes with the use of those chemicals on the environment, specifically on the biodiversity. Without going to the extent of the whole argument that these chemicals have not evolved in a day. Public and private institutions have put trillions of dollars over the last 80 to 100 years to develop them. During that time, agroecology and organic agriculture has not been supported with the commensurate funding from national, public, and private funding. In fact, the systems as we have them, organic systems, have been financed by resource-poor practitioners. If more money was put into research, there is no reason why organic systems should not produce a stable environment that would be able to feed the world, not just Kenya. And finally, there is an example in a country called Costa Rica, which is the country that really has gone into natural systems for production of food and also for a beautiful environment. And they appear to be succeeding much better than we who have opened our country to every whim and suggestions and ideas that are not necessarily natural, indigenous, or even true to ourselves, but occasionally harmful and very painful to both our production systems and to ourselves as individuals. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I see we are just about 5 minutes from our closing time. But if anybody would like to say a very quick final word of feedback from any of the questions, so we can then close. Is there somebody who'd like to add something from the panel?
Maybe a quick one, Rianne. I was just trying to type it. I think, as Professor Ome said, and the rest of panelists, I think why we are quoting EU and other countries, I think generally as a country, we've not, or even as an African continent, we've not invested in terms of food safety. You see, even in the dossier, we have a lot of gaps, we have lack of data. I'm sure if we did proper risk analysis, which is the way we should do a risk-based approach towards really validating and saying that this chemical is harmful and it can cause this and that. You need resources, you need money, you need investment, and this is where the government come, private investors, and that's why Professor Ome was saying we really need people to invest in research for you to validate or give evidence that this chemical can cause this type of toxicity like cancer. Then you need data, and that means research, you need funding. And so I'm hoping as this moves along, we'll have resources that can really validate some of these things. And we can actually have these resources available, especially for the academic and scientific world. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for your input. And with that, we will now come to a close. I'd like to thank each and everyone who made it, especially our audience who made time to be with us. I see that we had over 179 members in our audience. Please, let's take this conversation to the next step. I've seen there's a lot of feedback around how do we walk the talk? And as our panelists say, it all starts with us, but keep the conversation going. I'm glad that we did have Martin Ogindi, who's a politician, because these conversations cannot happen without you. In as far as in our country, we don't always look at politics in a positive way, but we need politicians to make us walk the talk, essentially. So thank you so much. I'd like to thank all the panelists as well for making time to be with us this afternoon. It has been an incredible conversation. The feedback from the audience has been amazing as well. And I want to thank you. I'll just mention your names quickly. Professor Wahome, thank you so much for making time to be with us this afternoon. Dr. Victor Shikuku, Dr. Catherine Kunyanga, Dr. Teresa Omoyo, Dr. Silke Bolhamore, and Honorable Gladys Bostrole, who unfortunately had to leave the meeting. And she was to give us a vote of thanks and some action as well, and give us some highlights of what she's doing in regards to the conversation around harmful pesticides. Unfortunately, she was not able to stay with us to the end, but I thank her, even in her absence, for making time to be with us this afternoon. I'd also like to thank Lila Libertrue, who's one of our organizers from Root to Food. Thank you for putting this together, and to everyone, have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Let's see you on Twitter. The hashtag is Toxic Business. Let it not end here. This conversation, as we all say, needs to be a national conversation. See you on the other side. Goodbye.
Blessings.
Or chemicals to apply on my farm. My name is Esther Chepkogei Beck. I'm a small-scale farmer in Uasin Gishu County. I'm also the executive director of a local NGO called Resources Oriented Development Initiatives that does agroecology